an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, today we are bringing you another 2-hour, two-guest show today, and we are internationally syndicated. I am broadcasting from the City of Angels, or some people say the City of Demons. Our home base network is Late Night in the Midlands, LNM, and the terrestrial affiliates associated with them, as well as Black Swamp Digital Radio. And in the United Kingdom, we have Deprogrammed Radio Network, as well as their terrestrial affiliates in London, Leeds, and wherever else they may appear. Now, the first guest has something to do with someone that is coming on Monday who had to abruptly change the schedule the other day. And the reason why I'm giving you hints, folks, is that way you get a chance to have seen all the promotion that we've done for this guest. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to say the name of the guest who's going to be on Monday, who was supposed to be on the other day. It's Dannion Brinkley. Dannion Brinkley said there's only one other person he trusts when it comes to near-death experiences and life-after-death experiences, and that happens to be Dr. Moody. And that happens to be our guest today for the first hour. So, Dr. Moody, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's really nice to be with you tonight.
It's the pleasure's all ours and all the listeners. Now, you are a philosophy professor and a psychiatrist. What led you to start going down the path of researching near-death experiences and life after death?
Well, maybe I should say in advance was that I pretty much escaped religion, fortunately for me, as a real young kid, and I was an astronomy buff. So I went to the University of Virginia at age 18, intending to study astronomy, but I took a philosophy course my first semester, and I was hooked. And so I went on and I became a philosophy major. But in reading that first book I read in philosophy, I was 18 years old, and it was Plato's Republic, which is today still one of my favorite books. So at the end of this Republic, there's a story of a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield and was revived and had this experience of leaving his body and going through into another world and so on. And that's what Plato's Republic is all about, actually, is a near-death experience, because the whole thing is focused to that very event at the end. And so I was just intrigued, and I asked my professor, Professor Hammond, is Plato for real about this? And he said, yeah, that the early Greek philosophers understood that sometimes somebody who appears dead actually is later revived, and they had studied cases of like this. And Plato's rough contemporary, a little earlier than Plato actually, was Democritus, who had figured out that contrary to your sense perception, that the table in front of you is smooth and continuous, Democritus had realized that it's actually made up of little invisible bits that are he called atoms. And so his take on the near-death experience was that this is something that happens due to the residual biological activity in the body. So that was what I knew in 1962. But in 1965, I met the guy who, in my whole life so far, 74 years old, George Ritchie was the finest person I ever knew. And I was an undergraduate philosophy student at UVA. And Dr. George Ritchie was one of the psychiatry professors there, and he had had such an experience. So he really inspired my thinking on this, and then I went on. I got my PhD in philosophy, and I began to teach philosophy at East Carolina University in North Carolina, and began to hear this from my fellow faculty members and from students who had had this. So went to medical school in 1972, and that was an opportunity, obviously, to gather lots more cases. So I wrote my book on the subject in 1974, and since that time, I mean, I've talked with thousands and thousands of people from all over the world who went to the brink of death and came back and had these astonishing stories to tell.
Your book that you wrote in 1974, was it received well, or was it put in the category of parascience or parapsychology or paranormal, the same way UFOs and ghosts were at that era?
It always sounds good to sound like a martyr, right? That would be a delightful thing. I was persecuted and so on. But in fact, it didn't happen. I was, one thing I've heard a lot over the years is, poor Dr. Moody was persecuted by the medical community. They thought he was a nut and so on. But actually, when I went to medical school at Medical College of Georgia, and I entered there in September of 72, but I had already been studying these experiences for some years by that time. And my friends that I'd grown up with, who were ahead of me in medical school, had already spread the word among the faculty that this medical student was coming in September. So just in the first couple of weeks I was there, 8 of my professors reached out and said, thanks for studying this. Several of them had had near-death experiences themselves, and others had heard this from their patients. So, and another thing about this, it's by 1974, when I wrote this book, there were just so many people who had undergone cardiac arrest because the cardiac resuscitation techniques and equipment came in, like in 50s, 60s, and so on. So by the 70s, there were just so many people who had been there and back, that really, as soon as the Life After Life came out, I began to get letters from doctors and nurses and professional people, as well as from people who had had their own near-death experiences. But, these doctors said, yeah, I've heard this from my patients, or they said, I read your book and I doubted it, so I happened to have a patient who had and I asked him, and he said, and so, it wasn't any big deal. So it would be a nice story to be able to say that I was persecuted, but I really wasn't, because by the time it came out, as I said, anybody who really seriously looked into it would be able to see that the pattern I described in there was accurate.
Let me ask you a question. Is there a common theme that you recognized over these thousands upon thousands of people that you've investigated who have undergone such experiences?
Yes, there absolutely is, and this has been confirmed repeatedly by medical doctors in various parts of the world who have investigated these experiences. And what we have is there are, say, about 15 to 17 or 18 common elements, and if you look at 1,000 case reports, the accounts people give of their experiences, you will see that some of these reports have 2 or 3 or 4 of these common elements, and some have 9 or 10, and occasionally you have people who have, typically people with extremely lengthy cardiac arrest who talk about the whole thing. But it's graded like that, and it seems to the longer the cardiac arrest lasts, as a general rule, the more likely a patient is to tell you of an extremely complex experience involving actually even glimpses of what appear to be other worlds. So, and this is now a very well documented medical phenomenon. We don't know, it's not for medical doctors to say what the ultimate meanings of these things is. That's probably more of a philosophical question in the end. But basically what people say is that invariably they say, for example, that they may actually hear the doctor say, "Oh my God, he's dead," or words to that effect. And they say that from their perspective, I've heard a lot of people say over the years words to the effect that I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead. Because what people tell you is that they become aware, they move away from their body, and very quickly they sort of lose interest in their body, very interestingly, and it's like their attention sort of turns to other things that are going on, but they may say they see the doctor or nurse trying to resuscitate their body, and they find they can't establish communication with the doctor or nurse. So very often that sort of occurs to them at this point that, oh, this is what we call death. And at that point say that they enter into states of consciousness that no matter how articulate they may be or however well educated, I hear people all over the world say things like, I just can't describe it to you. There are no words to adequately portray this. But in terms of what they try to tell us, they say it's as they go through a passageway of some sort, like a tube or a tunnel or hallway, and on the other side of it come out into this incredibly brilliant light. They say you could say light, you could say love. It's really just the same thing. And in that light, say that relatives or friends of theirs who have already passed over seem to be there almost as a greeting committee to sort of help them through this. And, you see your deceased relatives and friends, and you undergo panoramic memory in which everything you've ever done is portrayed around you in a sort of hologram, as people describe it, or and that it occurs instantaneously, but in that time you review all of the actions of your life, not through the eyes that you had when you were doing the actions, but rather from the point of view of the other characters that were involved, so that you actually feel the feelings that your actions brought about in other people with whom you've interacted.
So, for instance, like if you harmed somebody physically or emotionally, you're going to see through their eyes what they felt.
That's right, and not as punishment. There's no atmosphere of punishment about this at all. It's learning, and it's very often conducted in the presence of a being of complete compassion. People say a being of light who sort of guides you through this and ask you a question, in effect, not in words, but they say the situation makes the question arise. How have you learned to love? Because in this panorama, it comes forward to people that what this is really all about is love and learning loving relationships. And so when people come back from this, they're typically very affected. Some saying that whatever they were chasing before, whether it was power or fame or money or knowledge, as I have chased, or all these other things that people chase, that what they say this is all about is learning to love. And also coming out of this secure in their expectation that there is life after death, because they say that to them this experience convince them completely that what we call death is a transition into another reality.
Now, let me ask you this. When you mentioned other worlds, are you talking about possibly extraterrestrial worlds or maybe another dimension? I mean, what are these people
Well, I'm not
describing?
talking about extraterrestrial worlds per se, but what I mean by that is that people say that when you have this near-death experience, you find yourself in another framework of reality that is not oriented. You know, when did geriatric psychiatry for a while before I went into forensics, and you know, when you're trying to decide of somebody's orientation, whether they are oriented, like a patient you're examining in the emergency room or whatever, what you ask about is time, place, and person. Those are the three basic orienting modalities. And if I ask you what date today is, you could tell me, and roughly what time, and so on, and then where you are and the person you are, and so on. But people within the framework of a near-death experience, they say there is no more time or space, and that the person you are is kind of amplified or enhanced over the person you were in the body. So those, you know, when there's no time and no space and your personhood is amplified or put into some more, people say it's like, people compare it to like when you wake up in the morning from a dream, you feel like you're coming back to reality, right? And those weird images are receding, and you're trying to remember what it was, but it's fading, and you feel like you're coming back to reality. Well, that's how people with near-death experiences feel. They say that it's like they're waking up out of a dream, only this life is the dream. So that's what I mean by saying that, yeah, it's not this framework of reality that people experience in this near-death experience, which means that in order to comprehend these things, what we need is a set of logical principles or rational principles for how you think about transfer of consciousness or some progression of consciousness into some other framework of reality, I guess is the way I would put it. And I think there are ways of doing that now. I do. I think that we have got a point where we can begin to investigate these things. You mentioned parapsychologists. No, I am definitely not a parapsychologist. And as well-meaning as those people are, it's in 2018, it's the idea that life after death could be a scientific question. Somebody who tells you that, I think they're just not really aware of what they're talking about or haven't thought it through very well, because why life after death is still a philosophical question rather than a scientific question is that nobody has come up with a methodology which would enable us to confirm it or disconfirm it. But that's a different process from the process you go through in trying to come to terms with these things, because I remember, my life perspective was shaped at the age of 7 or 8 when I first looked through a telescope. And I had built myself a telescope, which, now I kind of laugh, but it must have not been too good. But you get the book and you go through, and but I remember that feeling of the idea. Well, I'm going to spend my life learning stuff, but I'll never know very much at all. And I have always been content with that. I just spent, I had 2 doctoral degrees before I was 31, plus 3 of those years I've been a philosophy professor. So, I have spent my life with my nose in books, and so I have always been acutely aware of the limitations, especially as, getting into philosophy and being a philosophy student, of the fact that the logic we use for everyday affairs just is not adequate for grabbing on to this question of life after death. But, so that's one issue. But then another thing is the personal process you go through. And one thing is, people say, oh, this is just the oxygen deprivation to the brain. That's not, well, that shows that these people haven't probed this very deeply, because I very early in my medical career, I was approached by a wonderful professor I had who told me that when she was trying to resuscitate her own mother unsuccessfully, that she herself, the doctor, got out of her own body and rose up and was able to see her mother's now deceased body down below and her own body down below. And she was trying to quote her, I was trying to get my bearings, as she said, and became aware of her mother, and again, to quote her, now in spirit form, unquote, there beside her, and then sort of said her goodbyes to her mother and saw her mother recede into this light. Well, that's not oxygen deprivation to the brain, right? My medical professor she wasn't ill or injured, and she had the same experience. And but I never took that explanation seriously. But then, what is it? I mean, I have really a long time sort of grappled with that one. But I tell you what really brought me around was, I don't know how many years ago now, because at 74 time goes fast. But some years back, I met a young man who is a graphic artist who, I don't know if you've heard about this case, but who was in a horrific car crash in which he lost his leg and his wife was killed instantly. And so he had a profound near-death experience during this. One of his children was killed and the other survived in this wreck. And so then in the aftermath, he finally, I guess, sort of got up the courage, because very often people won't talk about these things with their physicians. So to make a long story short, he contacted, as he was thinking, writing this up and so on, contacted one of the physicians, one of the emergency room trauma experts who had been there in the hospital. And so what this doctor said is that when the artist was in the operating room, that the physician actually saw and talked with the patient's wife, who was dead, but who appeared there in apparitional form and talked to the doctor to sort of reassure him and to help, I guess, understand this remarkable recovery. That now, at a certain point, you just run out of, and I'm sort of focusing on that one because it was really one that affected me very deeply when I first heard it some years back. But I hear this from doctors who say that during the resuscitation procedure or in their care of a terminal ill patient, that they see things that they will, I just hear this from all the time from doctors, so I know that this is what they experience. They say, for example, a lot of them that at the point where the patient dies, they see something leave the body, often from the point of view up above. That up, in the higher part of the body, like up the head or chest, and this is described as a sort of light, or described sometimes as globular, golden, or grayish. And I've heard a surgeon told me some while back that he looked at it and he said when it drifted up, it just exited through the ceiling. And or doctors saying that while they're resuscitating a patient, they see an apparitional form of the patient standing there in front of them, and so, something here is going on, which is, it takes it out of the realm of oxygen deprivation to the brain. And so where I have finally come to it is to say that, to my utter astonishment, there is life after death. Now, at the same time, I'm not trying to convince anybody else of that, right? People have got to go through their own process. But to me, another aspect of this, which is very important, is that I wouldn't be saying these things, even with the observation I had made, unless there was the background information that I think that I can solve the real problem with this, if you're really going to look at it as a rational problem, is the logical problem, that the logic doesn't fit. And don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I have been developing, even ever since I was in graduate school, actually, in philosophy in the 60s, developing ways to think logically about things that don't make sense. And since the notion of life after death doesn't make literal sense, I have essentially solved the problem of how you think about it logically. And this opens up entirely new ways to investigate the afterlife questions. Specifically, we can now prepare people's minds in advance with new principles of thinking, and such that when subsequently they just happen by chance to have a near-death experience, they are going to be able to put this into entirely new ways of expressing it that sort of get around the ineffability or indescribability problem, where people say, no matter how smart you are, you just can't put it into the words. Now we have a way that really helps that, and it's already actually had one success so far, but lots of people seem to think that what they want is some sort of rational proof of an afterlife. Well, what I would say is that, number one, not everybody wants a rational proof of an afterlife, right? Some people say that they're satisfied because of their religious faith or what they believe on faith. Other people say, well, I've had an experience myself, so I don't need a rational proof. And some people, but some people do say, I would like a rational proof. So now we're in a situation where we can begin to fill this in. So I think that we're in a very exciting period of, studying this afterlife question.
There's a question here, and let me read it. It comes from Sea Lover Riga, I think. Does Raymond know about Natalia Betereva? Do you know who that is?
I don't.
Okay, well, there's the answer. Miss or Sea Lover Riga, I did ask, so there's your answer.
Sorry. I'm sorry that I don't.
That's okay. Anyhow, a lot of people, I've seen this on YouTube several times, a lot of people say that they were either atheists or they had led a bad life and were very mean to people, and something happened where they ended up dying and they ended up in the depths of hell, and then they recall specific memories. Have you come across any cases like that where people going to heaven, people going to hell, or is it just people's own minds that are sort of perceiving that afterlife as being one or the other?
Well, yes, I have interviewed a number of people over the years who had hellish or negative near-death experiences. And what I find is pretty much what I gather other people have found who've looked into this, that yes, they do occur, and the trouble is that, to our investigating them, is that they are rare compared to the more positive ones, right? And so since it's easier to make inferences and judgments about a large number than a small number, I just, I don't understand them very well, and also because they are a lot less homogeneous than positive near-death experiences, by which I mean the negative ones I've heard recounted over the years are very different from one another. And the rarest subgroup of them seems to be the ones where they're actual flames and monsters and that sort of thing. And when it gets to that level, it's very hard for me to distinguish some of these stories from delirium, which is patients who are febrile or have a high fever, for example, or who have various kind of metabolic diseases, or who are sensorily deprived, and or from intoxications of various kinds, from various kinds of things, will get delirious. And the hallmark of delirium is these very vivid and sometimes surrealistically distorted visual experiences. And so I just don't know what to tell you about the negative ones. And one thing that I did notice was in the ones where people I talked with who had near-death experiences that were hellish, they didn't seem to me any different from the average person off the street, in terms of their moral character, or however you would characterize that. So I just don't know. I don't know. But I think also, it's a good thing to keep in mind when you are thinking about that, is that as I think about it, it seems to me, that it'd be hard to find out whether you might have an under-reporting problem, right? Because as I try to imagine the situation, I might be a lot more reluctant to tell somebody, say, that I had a hellish experience. So I gather it's probably, I would just assume it's possible that they are not as commonly reported, maybe because, people are just less likely to want to talk about it. But I don't know. That's speculation.
That's actually a very good reason. I would think that people who do have those hellish experiences do not want to share them as openly as they would positive experience. I do have a follow-up question from Sea Lover Riga. It says, regarding Natalie, I keep mispronouncing this name, Betriva. Is it? Yeah, Beteriva. Russian top psychiatrist, ? She actually established First Institute for Studying Brain, and she, in her interview, says she is a firm believer that this life is only a passage. I don't know if that's a question or comment to you, but that's the follow-up.
Well, you know something? I just got to say that I know a lot of doctors who are on that same wavelength, because you just see things in clinical practice if you deal with dying patients that are hard to put together, and I mean, I've talked with hundreds and hundreds of people with what you call shared death experiences who were there at the bedside of somebody else and who was dying. And as the person passes away, the bystanders experience parts of what we call the near-death experience, including, they say, seeing the spirit of the dying person leave the body or exiting their own body and going up part way toward the light with their dying friend or relative, or seeing apparitions of the deceased come into the room to sort of escort the dying person away, the room filling with light, and even empathic co-livings of patients. Life reviews occurs, and not just among close friends and relatives, but a physician, a very heartfelt communication telling me about being called to resuscitate a patient he had never seen, and during the resuscitation saw the patient's life review unfold all around him. And you know, the world is much stranger than common sense wants to make it, I think.
Agreed. That is absolutely true. Now, we got about 15 minutes left, so let me plug away some questions here. I would think, Dr. Moody, that people who undergo a near-death experience or people who have died and have come back are changed for the better. They have a better understanding of life, more appreciative. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I would think I generally would, and I'd also go on to say that people say it's very painful at times too, because there is something where people say that there's almost a nostalgia sometimes for the experience they had, and also that you come back into this world still a fallible human being. This wonderful Dr. George Ritchie I mentioned, who was the finest human being I ever knew. George was. He was just this terrific human being who had had a profound near-death experience. And George told me once in 1976, came by my house and said, Raymond, he said, this experience can make your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And what he meant by that was that even after you have this vision of pure love, that it's very difficult to put that into practice in in life, and that it's as I like to say, it's very hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? I would think you would agree, as people generally do. And so that doesn't go away. So people say it's still very hard to negotiate this life. And you have all the things. I mean, there's ups and downs, but they certainly are affected to the degree of not having any more fear of death.
Pam Rettenberg, my social media manager, asks, has he seen any of the elite pass, and was there an experience there?
Any of what?
The elite people, presidents, billionaires, etc.
Oh, no, I tell you, most of my friends are non-elite like me, or the people I know. I can't think of anybody that I saw who was famous or elite pass away, but no. Although I've talked with some very fine people who, are quite renowned, who did have near-death experiences. One, a very, very well-known actor or actress, in New York who, just a very, very fine person who told me years ago about her near-death experience, and it came after she had played some role, I won't say, but she had played some role for many years, and then this one night that was the last night she played that role, and she had, just coming off the stage and how she felt and so on. And she said some years later, then she had her near-death experience, and she said the closest she could come in earthly terms to describe what the near-death experience was like, she said it was like that last night, walking off the stage and leaving that role behind. And she said that's how I felt when I went to the next world, that I was leaving that role of me behind and, going into another framework.
Again, since we have a little over 10 minutes left and I want to get as much as possible, have you ever talked to people who have passed and come back that didn't go to another world but were actually still on Earth? Because I've had several guests that talk about seeing the people that have passed, and for some reason, whether they have an attachment from a person, a love, or something like that, they're still on this earthly plane, even though we, for the most part, us humans, cannot see them except for those select few. Have you come across anything like that?
Oh, yeah. And this has been invariably the ones I've seen who report this are people who have some extremely lengthy cardiac arrest that you can't even imagine how they might have lived. But in those circumstances, there are people who say that they see into this other world that seems to be sort of superimposed over this one that you and I are in now, and that they become aware that there are these people who don't seem to get it, that they're dead, and they're repeating some compulsion or just repeating something over and over. And, and yet the people who see this, they, become aware of this existence. They say that they can see among those people, there are other people who are in a sort of upbeat mood, beings of light kind of passing in and out among them. I gather kind of like trying to wake them up. Yeah, I've heard that from a number of people. And it's like the people I've had who've described that to me say that it's not anything to take very seriously. It's just like, I guess, maybe something like getting out of your body on the wrong side or something, and that there are people there who are just kind of waking them up, I guess, or trying to bring them back to the fact that they're dead.
Now, for those people who obviously if they're listening, they're alive right now, what advice would you give them that when they do pass, they go into a positive realm instead of a hellish realm? I mean, I would think the answer's pretty obvious, but I think some people need to hear it.
Well, I would say, I am not really in a position to be able to give people advice on how to pass over, except to say that, in terms of my own way of doing it, goes back to reading Plato's Republic, and then a couple of months later, another book by Plato called Plato's Phaedo. And in the real world, there's a lot of people who just want to say anything they want to say and not take this very seriously. But in the world of people who take this very seriously, the best book ever written on life after death from the rational point of view is Plato's Phaedo. And I read that probably October or November of 1962. I was 18 years old, and I still remember it just like it was yesterday. And I remember in there Plato says, philosophy is a rehearsal for dying, And even at 18, I knew exactly what that meant. And that meant that if you spend your whole life thinking about this and really going over it, then when you get my age, 74, it's just okay. You know, I am. The one neat thing about being 74 is I know exactly why I'm here, and that is that I have two grown sons who are doing great. They're on their own. I have a wonderful grandson. He's got his parents. And I have two young ones, 20 and 18, who are still in the growing process. So, you know, ideally, you don't get a choice, but ideally, it'd be nice for me to stay around a couple of more years to get them on their way. But I don't want to be caught in the situation in the nursing home and surrounded by tubes and so on. You know what I mean? I have to do my walk every day or else I go nuts. So I want to head out of here before, you know, immobility occurs. But what I would say is just spend time thinking about this. It's and I have taken a great deal of, inspiration on this, I guess you would say, from the wonderful people I've known who've had near-death experiences. Yep.
Now, for those people who have had near-death experiences but have not had any eye-awakening experiences, is there anything you suggest that they can do so they can maybe revisit what happened when they passed away, such as hypnosis or anything like that, so they can learn?
I don't know. I don't know of any general things. I know some of the Gnostic groups used to have a similar thing. It was part of their practice you would go out with a song or a poem, but part of your spiritual process and life was to come up with a song that you would sing or a poem you would recite that would take you over to the other side. And the idea would be that hopefully you could have the presence of mind on your deathbed to recite your formula, which would be a kind of password, right? Like it was regarded as like a magic word, like when the magician in the cartoon says "Wama Babama," and then you're in another framework, and that was the idea that just the right combination of nonsensical words and meaningful words can put you over there. And there's a great deal of truth to that. It really does work. That's how shaman songs work. But that involves a lot of, people don't need to worry too much about getting out of here because they're going to get out of here. It happens on automatic, right? But if you do have the blessing of a time to get ready, like learning of a terminal illness, then just talking helps, and listening to people who've had near-death experiences, I think, can help. So it's
now, since we are coming down to the last couple of minutes, let me ask you this: a lot of people believe, well, I don't want to say a lot, but there's a good portion of people that are atheists that believe that once you die, that's it. Done, you're over with. And then there's another set of people that believe that you will be reincarnated, either coming back as a bird or even as an extraterrestrial or a monkey or an insect or a fish. But there's other people that also believe, like we mentioned, that will either go to heaven or hell or be stuck on this plane. For those people who are atheists that believe nothing exists past our death, what would you say to those people?
Well, I do have a certain point of view about atheism that is put together not so much from my observation more as a psychiatrist than anything else. And I would distinguish that from agnostics, people who just say, well, I think it's indeterminable whether there's a God or not. That's one point of view, but atheism is often a sort of militant position that there absolutely is no God. And what I have noticed about that group is that, to me as a psychiatrist, they seem to be in the sort of adolescent frame of reference. Most of them are kind of, if you would ask what developmental level is this person at, they seem to me mostly to be adolescent-minded people who are just stuck in that rebellious frame of mind. And the fact, the energy they spend on thinking about God means they have a very powerful relationship with God. A lot of them sort of say that they were tormented by religion as a kid or moved away from it, but recently they've organized a church. I read about this. They said, well, we remember having good times at church, but, we don't believe in God, so we're going to have a church with no God. And, it's just, I think that kind of believer is, deep down, they're wrestling with this, and it's there, and the adolescent streak in them says, there is no God. But I think an agnostic person who just says, I don't have any way of knowing either way, is, that a lot of them I know, they just are logical people. But most atheists that I know are far from logical people. They're here on a cause. And but that would be my, and I think that it doesn't really matter. I mean, I can't tell you that I want there to be an afterlife. I mean, wishful thinking, I don't know what I would wish, but my process has sort of led me to the thought that I don't know what else to say. I mean, when the doctors tell me that they have, their experience coincided with the patient in a near-death experience, I mean, I'm out of sort of plausible scenarios to put in place of the idea that there's some sort of transfer into another existence when you going through the dying process, is what I gather.
And actually, from all the research I've done, I've actually found to be the same thing true, especially from talking to people such as yourself right now and Danny and Brinkley, who I've known for years. And it seems to me now, Dr. Moody, that so many more people are talking about life after death than in the past.
Right.
Do you have
right.
an idea of why it's become more of an open topic than it was, say, 50 years ago?
It seems to me to be cyclical. It does. And it seems to me, as Plato observed in the opening of his book, The Republic, he puts it to development that he said there's a certain kind of person, and he wrote about this in The Republic, and I saw it multiple times in my clinical practice with the elderly, that when people who are very practical and workaday, spent their whole lives in their business or whatever in the practical business of life, then when they get 50, 60, 70, they sort of looking back and they open up to this afterlife question. It's almost like it's built into our development. And by the way, in those terms, I mean, I am not mercenary, but I am very happily opening something on the internet, which, with my friend Lisa Smart and I have put together, and it's called the www is the address, www.theuniversityofheaven.com. That is www.theuniversityofheaven.com. And what we're doing is we're interviewing people who have near-death experiences, and we're interviewing doctors who've had near-death experiences, who have studied near-death experiences. And this is all going to be very serious stuff. In other words, we're filtering out the imposters and pretenders and people who act like they have the answers for people who are, just very serious about this. So we've had several webinars already, and they've gone over very well. So anybody who wants to follow this up and, really look at some serious issues about life after death and near-death experiences can go to that address. We'd love for you to join us. It's www.theuniversityofheaven.com is the address.
Well said, Dr. Moody. Well said. If there's any final statements or any other websites or books you'd like to plug in, by all means, let's take advantage of this now before we go to break.
Well, I think that's everything is there on the website. I'm really excited about it because I love teaching, but I tell you, I don't know, it's teaching in a university. It's the damn faculty politics. It's just, I like to teach. So this gives me a way to do my teaching over the internet, and I don't have to deal with, faculty politics and disputes and such. So I'm really happy with this.
Well said. Well, Dr. Moody, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Next time we need to do a full 2-hour show. And
Great.
If you have anybody who has any near-death experiences that you would like to invite on the show, I think that would be great. If we had more time, I would have given you something that occurred to me that probably would fall into that category is what other people said.
Great.
But I'm going to save that as a hook for the next time.
Okay.
Everybody
Great.
stay tuned. We'll be right back in a few short minutes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The pleasure is all ours. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be right back in a few short minutes.